Welcome back, Dr. Milo Wolf here today with Wolf Coaching, reacting to someone I've collabed with before. If you're not familiar with Jeff Nippard, he's got a great channel from what I've seen, and we've collabed on a video on the use of long length or lengthened partials. You can check that out right here. However, I'd like to react today to a video I haven't seen yet. Let me break it down from a sports science perspective.
In this video, I'm ranking 19 controversial fitness topics as either overrated or underrated. And for some extra scientific credibility, this time I'm pulling in exercise scientist Dr. Mike Israetel, who not only has a PhD in sport physiology, but is a competitive bodybuilder himself. I'm giving us 15 seconds each to explain why we think each item is overrated or underrated, and we'll be covering 3 categories: training, nutrition, and hot fitness topics. Here we go.
The first category is training, cheat reps, also known as ego lifting.
Go first.
It is a journey without an end or a purpose. When you think it through, cheat reps are stupid on almost all counts. You end up having a higher probability of injury, a lower probability of stimulating the target muscle, and a very difficult time tracking.
I agree that they're overrated. I think for the most part, people should use good technique. I would argue that on certain exercises, for example, bicep curls, if doing a little bit of cheating and slight momentum allows you to get another rep and then you control the eccentric, that might be an extra controlled eccentric that you wouldn't have gotten if you hadn't used that little bit of momentum. So I think that they can have some value, but I would still say overall, mostly overrated.
I largely agree with both Dr. Mike here and Jeff Nippard. Cheating is overrated. I would note that I'm not sure there's a huge effect on injury risk, especially if you're accustomed to it. At least there is an absence of evidence to support that claim. Not evidence of absence, but certainly absence of evidence. I think a better alternative to doing cheat reps to get an extra few exposures, for example, to the stretch position in a row, would be to just skip the shortened position altogether, right? If you wanted to handle more weight and get more exposures to that stimulating lengthened position, you could simply just not do the top half and avoid the fatigue that comes with cheating your rows instead.
Muscle soreness.
I think it can be a good proxy that you did actually hit the target muscle. It can be an indication that the muscle you were trying to hit was in fact stimulated. But I think a lot of people are under the impression that if you didn't get sore, that means you didn't have a good workout or you didn't grow muscle, which is definitely not true. And in that sense, I would say it's overrated.
I think it's become fashionable lately in the evidence-based community to say that soreness is overrated, or more specifically that soreness doesn't really mean anything and that soreness is only a side effect of novelty. I think that fails on about 7 or 8 logical grounds. When you do more volume, more intensity, proper progression, when you come closer to failure, when you generate a lot of metabolites, when you focus on the eccentric, when you train along muscle lengths, all of those things tend to cause more soreness. And to me, that sounds like a very, very close link causatively to hypertrophy. It's okay if you're not getting sore, but if you're not progressing and you feel like you're understimulating, trying to get sore is probably a good idea. And if you're getting sore, you have 99 problems, but stimulus is not one.
Okay.
I disagree with Mike here. I've actually spoken about this with him personally before. I don't think soreness is going to cause growth. I think the evidence currently isn't in that state yet. And I think that the argument that other things correlate with soreness and also with growth, and therefore soreness is something you should be paying close attention to in training, it's also a relatively weak argument to me. I would rather we have relatively more direct evidence on the topic before we make these claims.
Training each muscle only once a week, also known as a bro split.
There are better ways to train than training one muscle group once a week, especially if you're talking about small muscle groups. Like if you train your rear delts once a week or your biceps once a week, there's absolutely no way they take that long to recover. You just missed opportunity. And legs or something, or if you have a huge back is fine once a week, but it's also not optimal. I think you should train muscles when they recover. That generally occurs anywhere between every day or 2 times a week.
Yeah, I agree. A little bit of devil's advocate. The latest frequency research does show that a bro split is a viable approach, but I would say it's probably not the optimal approach.
Don't spend 2 hours per workout 5 days in the gym to do a perfectly fine approach. No one in here in the gym right now wants perfectly fine. They want jacked. It's the same number of days a week. You show up and not do a bro split, you get better results.
I actually agree with both Mike and Jeff here. I think bro splits are a viable approach in that they give you some hypertrophy, but they're not the optimal approach. And if you look at the research overall, broadly speaking, frequencies of at least 2 times a week are going to be better for hypertrophy than once, in all likelihood. And so, bro splits are overrated for hypertrophy. Then again, I don't think that many people are rating them that highly anymore anyways.
What about training to failure?
So I think overrated. I think that the research shows that there's not a huge difference in terms of hypertrophy or strength if you go all the way to failure or if you stop a couple reps shy. I think people think going to failure is super, super important. And I think you have to know what failure feels like, but I do think overall it's overrated and not as important as a lot of bodybuilders think.
Agreed, and I would add that most of the people that are saying that failure is super important are coming from an egotistical perspective in which they need to emotionally drain themselves in the gym, and it's more cathartic and psychological and less to do with what gets optimal results.
Nice. Okay, so I'm here editing this video now, and I kind of want to update my answer just a little bit. I still kind of think that training to failure is slightly overrated. However, there's a brand new meta-analysis that did find that on average, training to failure was better for muscle growth than not training to failure. That doesn't mean that every set you do needs to be taken to failure, but I would say it's important. If you don't take any sets to failure, I would say you are leaving gains on the table. If I had to update my answer, training to failure is properly rated to slightly overrated. But I'm gonna give Mike a quick call and see if he wants to give an update. Hey, Mike. In our last video, you said you thought training to failure was overrated. I'm just wondering if you'd want to update that.
Yes, training to failure is even more overrated. Probably more overrated than ever because of that recent meta-regression that came out that said that training to failure was superior for hypertrophy, but it turns out that's only the case if you train with very low volumes, you're not trying very hard, you're smaller, you're weaker, and you don't train very often. If you train a lot and you're really serious and you're really trying, in that very study, they say training to failure has no advantage. And because most people didn't read the study, almost no one read the study, I guess, then it's more overrated than ever.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
So I actually read the study, and I don't think Mike's conclusions here are perfectly representative of what the paper says. In fact, if you want a good representation of what the paper actually says, I would recommend checking this podcast out somewhere over here, where Mike speaks to the authors of the paper. Long story short, taking a set closer to failure is going to be better for growth. However, the magnitude of the effect, the exact shape of that effect, etc., are still somewhat less understood. Equally, it's unclear how exactly this translates into a real program that you're, for example, doing, where you're doing 5 days a week in the gym, 2 hours a week, versus in lab conditions where often they're training a lot less with lower volumes and so forth. So while some caution should be had, I think to say that it's wildly overrated and that no one read the paper, it's incorrect. I do think on a broader level though, the fact that they're calling training to failure overrated is probably correct. I think within the evidence-based fitness space, it's underrated. A lot of people just haven't seen the new evidence. But within the broader fitness space, most people think you need to train to failure to see hypertrophy, and that's not true. So it is overrated in that sense.
Okay, the mind-to-muscle connection.
You go first.
I think that people who prefer to talk about mind-muscle connection sometimes are right in a nuanced way, but often are doing a mind-muscle connection at the expense of good technique and a lot of load and the right movements and especially progression. So as long as your technique is good, you have progression, then mind-muscle connection becomes important, but it's very much a quaternary or tertiary variable.
I completely agree. I think it's one of those things that matters and is generally good, but I think people overstate how much it actually matters. You can get a good mind-muscle connection and not necessarily have a sufficiently stimulative set if you didn't push that set hard.
I agree, and in fact I think the research on mind-muscle connection is still in its infancy, and I have a whole video on that over here, but I don't think mind-muscle connection is something you need to focus on to see your best hypertrophy. And in fact, for the most part, I think that focusing on an explosive concentric, getting sufficiently close to failure, getting an adequate range of motion, an adequate stretch, etc., is going to be more important than focusing on muscle connection. And in fact, I think sometimes focusing on the mind-muscle connection can throttle your overall effort for that set.
How do you feel about pumps?
Okay, I'm gonna say properly rated. I think pumps are fun and they make training more enjoyable. They probably have some connection to hypertrophy, and I think people think that pumps are good and fun, and they are, so yeah, properly rated.
Sure. I just mean underrated, and I think pumps are great. And in the evidence-based space, I think pumps are underrated. Whether or not you got a really good pump is a good gauge of if the target muscle was hit, if it's the right place that they're getting pumped, and also a good gauge of volume.
Yeah, I disagree with Mike's take on pumps here. I think the evidence on pumps as a means to tell whether or not your training is effective or whether a certain exercise is more effective, it's just not there. And in fact, the evidence is quite mixed. So I wouldn't use pumps as a means to guide your training substantially. The only case where I'd use a pump to guide your training is if you have a reasonable protocol, doing a good number of sets, a good number of reps, relatively close to failure, and an exercise you think is good, but you're getting zero pump, that might be something to look at. But outside of that very extreme circumstance, I don't think pump is something you should pay attention to.
The next category is nutrition. Let's start with dirty bulking.
I think dirty bulking can be fun. It can lead to strength gain, but overall, it leads to vastly disproportionately more fat gain than it does muscle gain. And for that reason, I think it's overrated.
I mean, I have the stretch marks and loose skin to prove it. So I used to do it. I thought it was great. It was a lot of fun. It caused a lot of irreversible side effects. And I wish I would have stayed leaner, and it sure shit would have gotten me laid more often in college.
Yep, I agree with both of them as far as dirty bulking goes. The research suggests that you can make solid gains in just maintenance, for example. You can make better gains in a bulk, but the size of the surplus probably doesn't need to be tremendous. And in fact, I think if you're gaining 0.5% of body weight to maybe 1% of body weight a month on average, you're likely getting the vast majority, maybe 95+% of your hypertrophy while minimizing fat gain. Whereas dirty bulking is just gonna curtail your bulking phase because you have to cut because you just gain too much body fat. And so it often curtails your bulk phases and makes them less effective as a result.
1 gram of protein per pound of body weight.
Ooh, I'm going to do the Jeff Nippard. It's just a little bit more than enough protein than you need for almost all cases. And because it's just a little bit more than enough, if you eat a relatively balanced diet, it obviates the need to pay high attention to protein quality. And it's a really easy number to remember. And if you live in the great nation of the United States of America, then you do pounds, goddamn. Woo!
But grams for food still.
Woo!
Okay, I'll say properly rated as well. I like 1 gram per pound with the caveat that it is actually more than you need in almost all instances. When cutting, I would say 1 gram per pound is a good rule. When bulking, you probably only need like 0.7 or 0.8 grams per pound.
Yep, I agree. And I think 1 gram per pound is overkill, don't get me wrong, because that's 0.6 grams per kilogram higher than you probably need. But equally, it's just easy to remember. So if you just want a general heuristic that gets you maximum hypertrophy, even at the expense of over-consuming protein, and by that I mean the literal over-expense, because you're spending more money than you would otherwise need to, then feel free to follow it. I think it's appropriately rated to slightly overrated because it is more protein than you benefit from.
What about body recomposition, also known as recomping?
I think recomping is underrated because most people in the general population can very reasonably expect to build muscle while losing fat at the same time, even though a lot of people in fitness culture tend to say, oh, you need to cut in bulk. I don't think that's actually true for most people.
I think those are great and valid points. I'm coming at a slightly different perspective. Just because you can do something and it is effective doesn't mean there's not a better way to do it. Almost all goals that you could achieve with recomping, you could do better with dedicated cutting and bulking. If you want to be jacked or lean, then recomping will only take you so far. And after it runs its course, which is probably in about a year of dedicated recomping, you'll get almost all of it that you will. After that, you're going to have to pull some bigger triggers.
I think the research on actual bulking and how big your surplus should be, and I have a whole video on that here, doesn't suggest that there's as much of an effect on your hypertrophy as Mike suggests here. There is an effect, but that is achieved with a pretty small surplus to potentially no surplus. So the effect of going from maintenance into a surplus is very marginal. And so I think it's pretty much appropriately rated to slightly underrated. So in this case, I actually agree more so with Jeff.
Diet breaks.
I'm gonna say underrated. There really shouldn't be any like major rush to get lean. I think in general, people try to rush fat loss too much, and they'd be better off just like chilling out a little bit, taking the foot off the gas every once in a while, allowing your training to improve, allowing your muscles to fill back up. People could take a week or two off and just put their calories up to maintenance or even slightly above, and it would actually benefit them in the long run.
I think people like to lose all the weight they need to lose all at the same time. And generally, when it's more than 10% of your body weight, and even that's a high figure, you're gonna have to take a long multi-month diet break for all of the diet fatigue to settle before you go on. So I think lose, 5 to 8% of your body weight, take 2 or 3 months of maintenance, and then try again.
I agree with diet breaks, but the truth is that they don't make that big of an impact. A recent meta-analysis on the topic, I'll put it up on screen somewhere, has shown a slight benefit to diet breaks as it relates to maintaining your energy expenditure, or essentially keeping your basal metabolic rate a little bit higher. But that is a pretty small benefit. For a lot of people, whether you prefer diet breaks or not is kind of down to you. Whether you implement them or not is mostly personal preference and how it fits or whether it fits into your lifestyle. I think the effect is quite small, but there is one, and I think diet breaks by and large have a good amount of proponents in their favor already, so I think it's a bit overrated, if anything.
About clean eating.
Controversy.
I think it's overrated because, for one, it's really, really hard to define. Everybody has a different definition of what eating clean means. If you take it to the extreme, you can get some really disordered eating behaviors. Ultimately, it can become so clean that there's nothing left on the menu. I think it's better to focus on an inclusive approach to diet. So you want to include a variety of different foods. For health, you want to include a bunch of different fruits and vegetables. And I don't really think any foods should be like strictly off the menu.
I think everything you said is valid, but I would say that clean eating is relatively easy to define. It is the absence of intentionally high palatability processed junk food. And I think that taking those foods mostly out of your diet, especially as a fat loss phase gets hard, can be really hugely advantageous. But in most other circumstances, mass gaining, maintenance, and even the beginning of a diet, some fun foods are awesome and a great part of life.
Okay, I would agree with that. On a fat loss phase, you should try to reduce the super palatable, highly processed foods. That makes sense.
I agree more so with Jeff here in terms of you shouldn't have foods that are off your diet plan entirely unless you have a valid reason for it to be that case. The focus should more so be on establishing health promoting habits, like for example having your 5 a day, maybe even 10 a day, and generally having a pretty satiety promoting diet, having your protein, etc. But the inclusion of some additional snack foods are usually not going to make or break your diet. And in fact, there is research suggesting that by adopting a clean eating approach versus a flexible dieting approach, that will usually result in a lower micronutrient diversity within your diet, thus potentially leading to worse health outcomes.
The third category is hot fitness topics.
Oh, geez. I thought these were all hot topics.
How do you feel about natty or not videos?
All right, I'll take this one. From the creator's standpoint, I think they're overrated because I believe in innocent until proven guilty, and if you're just speculating on someone's natural status on scant evidence, then you could be hurting their reputation. From the viewer's standpoint, I don't think they actually give you any value apart from just the fun of the drama, I guess, because the idea is that if they're not natty, then it's not realistic for me to look like them. But you can't really look like anyone else anyway because of genetic differences, right?
Yes.
So I think that from both the creator's standpoint and the viewer's standpoint, super overrated.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is I think true natty or not journalistic approach, where someone who has made a real commitment to being drug-free and is lying about it, I think that's awesome. Exposing those frauds is a great thing. But natty or not videos are like when you've done zero research, you're just yelling at the camera and pretending you know things that you don't about anyone. And by the way, for context, I'm not natty. Just in case anyone wanted to say anything.
Fair enough.
I agree with both Jeff and Mike here. If you ever see me making a natty or not video, just assume I've been taken over by a reptilian, just a very good lookalike.
What do you think about the idea that natty training is completely different from enhanced training?
Who wrote these? All right, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just like a fiction designed by two people, one natties that need an excuse for why they're not getting jacked, and two drug-addicted idiots that think that they don't have to read science papers.
I would say enhanced people can probably recover better. Is that not true either?
It's a very nuanced topic.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true, but if you're enhanced, that means you're more jacked, and as soon as you become more jacked, that enhanced recovery difference goes away because you're more jacked, you're stronger, you're bigger, and it's way harder to recover, so it just ends up leveling the playing field, and you get so big that you have trouble recovering even though you're enhanced.
So for all intents and purposes, like training principles are training principles.
Yes.
Okay.
I agree that the training principles for natty training versus enhanced training likely remain the same, and full disclosure, enhanced training, not my expertise. Natty king right here. But I do think that generally people on steroids will have greater recovery, and generally people who are on steroids will have been training for longer as well, and that then predisposes them to have more of the repeated bout effect in place, which also allows them to train more and still recover. So I just think we need to tread cautiously, myself included, when it comes to saying that they should be different or they shouldn't be different. We just don't fully know.
Cold showers.
Research-vetted way to reduce hypertrophy. If you think that they offer you an effect of that sort of shock therapy, waking you up and it being a sympathetic driver for part of your day, because sympathetic parasympathetic balance is really good, then you don't train hard enough. Go train.
Yeah, I think overrated. I feel like it's just a lot of hype with very, very little evidence.
Except for reduce hypertrophy.
Yeah, reduce hypertrophy. It does seem to definitely do that.
All right, well, I have made a video on ice baths before, you can check that out here, suggesting that ice baths do in fact blunt hypertrophy. There's a huge caveat here and a reason why I don't agree with Dr. Mike here. The studies that have found worse hypertrophy from cold water immersion, for example an ice bath, are usually, one, performed right after training, and two, usually you're immersing yourself in cold water for at least 10 minutes. Most of the cold shower protocols I've seen are either not immediately after training and or last 30 seconds, a minute maybe. And so I think to suggest that the effect from cold showers and ice baths are the same, that's a stretch. Would I recommend cold showers to someone looking to optimize hypertrophy? No. But do I think they're going to kill your gains or substantially reduce hypertrophy? Very unlikely.
All right, locking out the knees is dangerous.
Go ahead.
There's neither evidence nor rationale for that, and your knees are designed to lock out, and if you control the lockout gently and you don't snap into it like a psycho and turn your muscles off at the end, and you're not one of the people with some sort of laxity disorder, you're gonna be just fine. And you need strong knees.
Again, I think it goes back to people approaching training with a very fragile mindset. They think if they just move in slightly the wrong way, then everything's going to break and it's going to be the end of them. It's not true.
I agree with Mike that there's no evidence that locking out the knees is going to cause injury. Again, it's an absence of evidence. And I agree with Jeff that this frailty mindset of training is going to cause you injury, you're going to get snapped up, your body can't adapt or can't cope with stressors is also wrong. But I do disagree with Mike when he says that the knees are designed to lock out and therefore less likely to get injured when you're locking out. As much as Mike's reasoning is typically solid, in this case it is kind of a naturalistic fallacy wherein it's like, you know, nature or God designed you to lock out your knees and therefore it isn't going to cause injuries. There are many activities and behaviors that we as humans did for millions of years that would still then lead to early death or injury or illness. That doesn't mean that they're not going to cause injury just because you were designed to do it.
Filming in gyms.
I think underrated.
That was my reaction to Jeff Nippard and Dr. Mike Israetel, I guess, on this video, breaking down some of their takes on training science, nutrition science, and so forth. I would give Jeff like a 7 or 8 out of 10, and Mike like a 6 or 7 out of 10 in this case, oddly enough. Like usually I prefer Dr. Mike Israetel's takes over Jeff Nippard's takes, but in this video, I actually found myself agreeing more with Jeff versus Mike Israetel. If you enjoyed the video, please consider commenting, liking, subscribing. If there's anyone else you want to see me react to from an exercise science perspective, leave a comment down below and I'll get to it. And in the meantime, have a great week, and I'll speak to you soon. Peace.